The logical conclusion of this study is that in order to maximise nominal economic output, the government should encourage smoking. Now, obviously that particular suggestion is ridiculous, but it still highlights the often difficult problem that what is best for the individual is often not what is best for a society. And since the science of economics is centred around what to do with fundamentally limited resources, genuinely deadly trade-offs like these need to be considered, and the right choice is not always so obvious. This is also assuming that decision makers within an economy, from heads of state to regular everyday people, are acting in a logical way to maximise positive outcomes, instead of making decisions based on ideology, personal gain, or just regular old ignorance, which, as most economists will know, is a pretty big assumption. The consequences of these tough decisions, even if they are made with the best intentions, can, and have, cost the lives of billions of people throughout human history. And if that sounds like hyperbole, many world-leading economists, including one very notable Nobel laureate, beg to differ. What's most concerning is that a lot of the mistakes made in the past from when economists just didn't know any better or economists didn't exist are still being made today. So, what are the examples of the biggest economic failures to learn from throughout history? What failures are we making right now? And finally, how many billions of people have died over time because of poor economic policies? Economics can be a depressing subject. When you get down to the raw numbers, you can see just how much human suffering can be created, even when people do have the best intentions. You can spend a lifetime complaining about all of the things that are wrong in the world, but I've found that it makes me much happier to deal with my issues rather than getting stuck in a loop of shouting into the ether, and therapy has really helped me to do that. That's why I'm proud to be sponsored by BetterHelp. It's not just talking about your feelings, and working with my licensed therapist, I've found taking back control of the decisions that I can make and letting go of the things that I can't has made such a huge difference in how I feel every day. I can't remember the last time I woke up in the morning feeling like I don't even want to get out of bed. I'm excited to start the day and enjoy the time I have to spend on this beautiful planet. If you've ever felt long periods of being down, frustrated, or stressed out, we've all been there, and you know you're not alone. With BetterHelp, you can choose your therapist and schedule your sessions completely according to your timetable. I hope talking to a licensed therapist at BetterHelp will help you as much as it's helped me, and if you go to betterhelp.com/EE, you'll receive not only a 10% discount on your first month with BetterHelp, you'll also be supporting this channel at no additional expense to you. Economics as an academic discipline is currently in crisis. Microeconomists that study small-scale interactions and personal decision-making characteristics have been outed left, right and centre for falsifying the results of their studies so they could report outcomes that just sounded interesting rather than outcomes that were actually true. Macroeconomists, on the other hand, have been arguing over their ideas for decades because, unfortunately, it's very hard to run macroeconomic experiments at all, since by definition it's the study of interactions across entire markets, often at a national or even global scale. The best that macroeconomists can do is learn from history, and unfortunately there is an endless list of mistakes to learn from. In 1958, in an effort to modernise, China, which was in the process of redeveloping its economy following the Second World War under its new communist system, wanted to increase steel production. The economic theory was that steel is a vital component of building out modern industrial equipment, so the more steel an economy has, the more factories and machines and infrastructure it can build, which will increase total output and result in more resources to be shared amongst all participants. In theory, at least, this isn't wrong. Economic growth and steel consumption are highly correlated in the world today for exactly this reason. If an economy uses machines made of steel, it'll be able to produce more and further develop more stuff made from steel. The way China went about this, though, took a theoretically sound economic idea, probably even made with the best intentions of genuinely improving the quality of life of everybody in the country, and came up with backyard furnaces. Instead of investing in a few high-quality steel smelting plants, the Chinese government at the time encouraged farmers to produce basic furnaces made out of bricks and clay that would burn whatever they could find for fuel, like wood from trees, tools, and in some cases, even coffins. The backyard furnaces were so heavily encouraged by the government at the time that farmers would fell entire forests surrounding their fields and prioritise producing steel over producing crops. The government knew this was happening, but assumed that if they could increase steel production and rapidly industrialise, then those same farmers could use tractors and advanced harvesting tools instead of the basic hand tools they were using, which would massively increase agricultural output in the long run. Again, not an entirely terrible assumption. Farming today is highly industrialised, and just one farmer with a combine harvester can do as much work as 100 farmers with hand tools in the same amount of time. Unfortunately for the Chinese economy, they failed to realise that industrial development leads to producing more steel, but just producing more steel will not create industrial development. Amongst some other factors, the proliferation of backyard furnaces were one of the primary drivers of the Great Chinese Famine that started a year after and led to the death of between 15 and 55 million people. approximately the same amount of casualties experienced by every country in World War II combined. This tragedy was not born out of violence, but just bad decision-making. Beyond simply taking farmers' attention away from focusing on farming, this failed economic project also led to soil erosion because of all of the trees that were cut down around fields to fuel the furnaces. Millions of unified workers all banding together to create steel for the common good of the nation also might have aligned nicely with the ideologies of the party, but even after all of the damage it did, it created really crappy steel that wasn't useful for anything, and most of it eventually had to be reprocessed at a proper steel plant like it probably should have been in the first place. Now, it's almost easy to look back at decisions like this and see that just like encouraging more people to smoke, encouraging farmers in a mostly agrarian country to stop farming and ruin their fields was never going to be a good idea, even if it did have some theoretical economic justification. There is unfortunately no limit to other historical lessons like this, even over the past century, and this is to say nothing of the instances when economics is intentionally used as a weapon to subdue a population or entire nation through things like trade restrictions and sanctions. In some of these cases, the ends may justify the means, and economic hostilities may be seen as preferable to military hostilities, but there will still be casualties. Even maintaining the focus on just policies enacted to benefit economic participants. Where this gets a lot harder is when we don't have the benefits of hindsight, and untested theories are all we have to determine what is for the greater good. The reason that it's important to realise that economics is much more than just making people as wealthy as possible, and that it's a discipline that impacts everybody in the world in drastic ways, is not just feel more important than chemists and physicists who get Nolan movies made about them. It's more that it shows the need to take economic policies very seriously and understand what economic success really is. Now, that might sound a bit philosophical, but perhaps that's the point. There is a very real debate being had right now amongst some of the greatest minds in the profession about what the role of a good economist should be. On one hand, there are those that argue that economics is a science like any other science, and everything should be done with rigorous experimentation and subservience to the data. To that end, economists should find and support policies that maximise measurable results like output, wealth, and human development. According to world-leading economists, and most importantly the economists that are actually making policy decisions in governments and organisations around the world, a data-backed and somewhat clinical approach to economics has been the predominant way of effectively running the planet for the past 4 decades. This is a trend that has been helped along because collecting and analysing economic data is a lot easier now with computers. Using data and rigorous analysis takes a lot of the emotion and, most importantly, ideology out of the economic process and gives leaders a guide on what to do in order to maximise measurable outcomes. Put simply, it removes the opportunity for people to make catastrophic economic mistakes because they think they know best. Now, of course, as fantastic as the scientific method is, there are some genuinely fatal problems with this approach that have led economists to argue that a more philosophical basis for conducting economics might actually be better. One obvious problem is that policymakers don't always follow the advice given to them by economic advisors, and overly technical ideas are even more difficult to explain to the general public, which in a good functioning democracy should be the ultimate decision maker. Sometimes a good enough idea that will actually get implemented is better than a perfect economic plan that will never be considered. There is also the problem of applying very rigid statistics to what is fundamentally a human-focused science. If all an economist cares about is maximising measurable outcomes, then their solution to the trolley problem might be to run over the single person tied to the train tracks, and then back up and run over the second group because it eliminated 6 economically dependent individuals and doubled the time worked for the tram driver. If that sounds overly dramatic, there are genuinely solutions like this that modern economic theories have supported, but more on that later. One other major problem with treating economics, especially at a macro scale like other sciences, is that it's much harder, or in many cases totally impossible, to run experiments on an economy, because it's filled with millions of unpredictable variables that can't be controlled like experiments in a nice sterile lab. Even running microeconomic experiments, which are more focused on individuals and their decision-making processes, are notoriously difficult because even though economists sometimes assume that people are perfectly rational, they are of course anything but. And finally, an overly data-driven approach to economic decision-making will naturally put a greater emphasis on improving things that are easily measurable, rather than intangible stuff like human fulfillment and happiness, which is much harder to plug into data analysis software, but arguably even more important than stuff like net output per capita. The alternative to the cold-hearted, data-driven approach to economics is to have economists basically be philosophers and make judgments about what people truly value and the best way to achieve those goals. Angus Deaton won the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 2015 for his work analysing the role that economic consumption plays in human welfare. He has since released a number of works, including a book titled Economics in America, that proposes an alternative to how modern economists should study economics. And his arguments are particularly relevant to one of, if not the most significant economic issues being debated today, globalisation. Globalisation is the general trend of countries to trade, invest, and cooperate more freely